Oh, it's lovely. Wonderful to be on the water. As always, special time of the year.
Nothing made Ted Kennedy happier than being at his home in Hyannisport, at the center of the famed family compound on Cape Cod, surrounded by his wife Vicky and his beloved Portuguese water dogs. It is where Kennedy went after he was diagnosed with brain cancer in May of 2008. The cancer diagnosis was devastating news for the Kennedys, whose family narrative is marked by epic highs and lows. Ted became the patriarch after the death of his two older brothers, John and Bobby. In addition to his own 3 children, he was a father figure to dozens of nieces and nephews. The road Ted Kennedy traveled was both heralded and heartbreaking. Personal tragedy and self-imposed controversy headlined much of his storied life. But in the end, he built himself a monumental legacy in the nation's capital, a legacy of fighting for the little guy. And he built, by most assessments, a brilliant and productive career in the U.S. Senate. Edward Moore Kennedy was the youngest of Rose and Joseph's 9 children. Ted was born in Boston on February 22, 1932. He attended the best private schools, always surrounded by wealth and privilege. Kennedy's mother was the daughter of Boston's 2-term mayor, John Honey Fitz Fitzgerald. His father was a prominent businessman and political figure. It was a charmed life, but there were losses as well. Oldest brother Joe died in World War II. Sister Kathleen died in a plane crash. In 1950, Kennedy went to Harvard, spent some time in the Army, then went on to the University of Virginia Law School. In 1958, he married the socially prominent model Joan Bennett of Bronxville, New York.
Another Kennedy has thrown his hat into the national political arena.
By 1960, Ted had caught the political bug and wanted to run for the U.S. Senate seat his brother John vacated when he was elected president. By the time of the state Democratic convention in Springfield, Kennedy was in a heated battle with State Attorney General Edward McCormick, the nephew of the Congressional House Speaker John McCormick.
30-year-old Ted Kennedy wins the convention endorsement by nearly 2-1. But Mr. McCormick says that he will still run in the primaries in September.
McCormick's slogan was, "I back Jack, but Teddy ain't ready." In a famous encounter that became known as the Teddy and Eddie debate, McCormick gave this famous line:
"If his name was Edward Moore, with his qualifications, with your qualifications, Teddy, if it was Edward Moore, your candidacy would be a joke. But nobody's laughing."
But with the power of the Kennedy name behind him, Ted won the primary with almost 70% of the vote. He then went on to beat Republican George Cabot Lodge in the general election to become one of the youngest U.S. senators in history.
And another new face is Daniel Inouye of Hawaii. Most interest, however, centers around Edward Ted Kennedy, the 3rd brother to achieve success in the national political arena.
Life was good for Ted Kennedy. He had a beautiful wife and 2 small children, Kara and Ted Jr. But the seemingly happy days were short-lived. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was a devastating personal tragedy. Ted immersed himself in his Senate work. He took on the mantle of his deceased older brother, focusing not on protecting the interests of those in his own privileged social class, but pushing for policies that would improve the lives of the middle and lower classes.
Too many of our senior citizens are being forced to choose between neglecting their ailments or being pauperized by them.
And he started to become a popular figure in other parts of the world.
Making a final stop on his tour of Ireland, Senator Edward Kennedy finds 100,000 people in the streets of Limerick to give him a tumultuous send-off.
Kennedy was re-elected to his first full 6-year Senate term in 1964. During that re-election bid, Kennedy nearly lost his life in a plane crash.
Senator Edward M. Kennedy was seriously injured when his private plane crashed in the woods near Southampton, Massachusetts.
It happened on the way to the state Democratic convention in Springfield. The pilot and one of Kennedy's aides were killed. Kennedy spent weeks in the hospital recovering from severe injuries.
His family, including Attorney General Robert Kennedy, quickly gathered at his bedside, and specialists were flown from Walter Reed Hospital. Doctors say that it was a miracle that Mr. Kennedy survived the crash.
Kennedy spent the next several months campaigning for his 1964 bid from his hospital bed.
I'm coming along now. The doctors estimate that I'll be out of the hospital around Christmas time. I'm planning on Thanksgiving. I haven't mentioned that to them yet, but I plan to in the next few days.
In November, Kennedy won election to his first full 6-year term.
Senator Edward M. Kennedy leaves New England Baptist Hospital for Palm Beach to spend the holidays with the Kennedy clan. He dropped 20 pounds and wears a leather brace that will help support his back for some time to come.
Life for Kennedy then resumed some sense of normalcy. His third son, Patrick, was born, and Kennedy went about learning the ropes of the U.S. Senate. But in 1968, tragedy would strike again.
Stay back. Please stay back. Everybody else, just please stay back.
Kennedy's last remaining brother, Robert, was assassinated in California just after winning the Democratic presidential primary in that state. Ted delivered the eulogy at Bobby's funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York.
Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today pray that what he was to us, what he wished for others, will someday come to pass for all the world.
That next year, Kennedy was widely regarded as a frontrunner for the presidency, but that dream was shattered in 1969 following a car accident on the island of Chappaquiddick that killed campaign worker Mary Jo Kopechne. The senator swam to safety.
I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately.
The incident remained a dark cloud throughout Kennedy's life. Difficult times continued for Kennedy in the 1970s. Oldest son Ted Jr. lost a leg to cancer, and Kennedy's 20-year marriage to Joan, while looking strong on the public stage, was privately in crisis. Still, Kennedy's name began surfacing again as a possible presidential candidate. And in 1979, he started planning his run, an unusual challenge against the sitting Democratic incumbent, President Jimmy Carter. Kennedy got off to a shaky start following an interview with CBS reporter Roger Mudd and the rambling answer he gave to this question.
Why do you want to be president?
Well, were I to make the announcement and to run, the reasons that I would run is because I have a great belief in this country that it is.
The awkward and passionless response went on for more than 2 minutes. Even his supporters began to question if Kennedy really wanted the job. Still, he continued with the presidential bid at the 1980 Democratic Convention, where he finally conceded to Carter and went on to give what many consider the signature speech of his career.
For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
The emotional roller coaster would continue for Kennedy. By the mid-'80s, he had divorced his wife Joan and lost a nephew David to a drug overdose. His own son Patrick was treated for cocaine addiction. Kennedy also developed a reputation for leading a bachelor lifestyle unbefitting a U.S. senator. Then in 1991, his nephew, William Kennedy Smith, was arrested for raping a woman in Palm Beach. Kennedy had been out drinking with Smith at a Palm Beach bar hours before the incident occurred. Just before the rape trial began, Kennedy gave a speech at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government in which he apologized to the people of Massachusetts for past bad behavior.
I recognize my own shortcomings, the faults in the conduct of my private life. I realize that I alone am responsible for them, and I am the one who must confront them.
It seemed to be a turning point for Kennedy. A year later, at the age of 60, he married Victoria Reggie, a Washington lawyer 22 years his junior.
Send me back to the United States Senate so that I can fight to strengthen our economy.
Ted Kennedy's out of touch.
In 1994, Kennedy faced the biggest political challenge of his life when Massachusetts businessman Mitt Romney ran as the Republican nominee for Kennedy's Senate seat. Less than 2 months before the election, Romney had a slight edge in the polls. But Kennedy took charge of the campaign and ended up winning that election by a 17-point margin. Still, it was a wake-up call for Kennedy, who was now into his 60s and increasingly aware of his own legacy and mortality.
I know that he advised some people, and I'm trying to remember.
For all the controversy that characterized Kennedy's first 6 decades, the turn of the century cast him in a new light.
Senator Kennedy's friends on the other side admire the same quality in him. We may disagree with his policies, and we do, but we respect him for his remarkable commitment and persistence in pursuit of those ideas, those principles.
Kennedy became widely known as the liberal lion of the United States Senate, revered by his Democratic colleagues and respected by most of his Republican opponents as one of the most effective and prolific members of Congress.
It will not move Iraq towards self-government.
In 2002, Kennedy took the lead role in the fight against the Iraq War, voting against the resolution that allowed President Bush to go to war, and then speaking out at every point along the way.
The case for war seems to have been based on shoddy intelligence, hyped intelligence, and even false intelligence.
The president's war has been revealed as mindless, needless, senseless, reckless. This administration was on a pathway of a rush to war, a shoot from the hip, my way or the highway.
It was a voice that, after so many decades, Democrats took for granted. Kennedy was the man they could count on in a fight. So it perhaps shouldn't have been shocking, though it was.
Thank you, thank you.
When in August, while undergoing chemotherapy treatment, Kennedy walked on stage at the Democratic National Convention in Denver.
This is the cause of my life, new hope, that we will break the old gridlock and guarantee that every American, north, south, east, west, young, old, will have decent, quality health care as a fundamental right and not a privilege.
It is that Ted Kennedy, the feisty fighter, who will live on. The admittedly flawed man who, through his perseverance and commitment, left a legacy of policies that will benefit generations to come. And with his passing comes the close of an era, the Kennedy era, that began with Camelot and ends with the passing of Edward Moore Kennedy. Allison King, NECN.